Have you ever wondered why comics were just so freaking weird in the 50s and 60s? The answer is right there on the cover. This is Issue at Hand, Polygon's series about the weird world of comics. I'm your host, Susana Polo, and today we're going to talk about the Comics Code. Let's do some scene setting. The year is 1954, and it's the height of the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism. The American public is experiencing a wave of fear centered on the idea of juvenile delinquency. And psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wertham has just published Seduction of the Innocent, a polemic attack on comic books. Wertham's work had already led to a spate of public comic book burnings around America in the late 1940s. Wertham is one of the supervillains of American comics history, but like a lot of historical figures, he was more complicated than his legacy suggests. In 1946, he opened a low-cost psychiatric clinic in Harlem for black teens, and during the landmark Brown v. Board of Education trial, he testified that segregation was psychologically harmful to all children, whether they were white or black. But Seduction of the Innocent, the apex of his criticism of comics, is now known to have been based on manipulated data from his career working with troubled teens. It claimed that there was a direct link between comics and juvenile delinquency, homosexuality, and fascism. And its popularity led to 3 public hearings of the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency regarding the threat that comic books pose to children. Most famously, William Gaines of EC Comics was grilled by Senator Estes Kefauver during those hearings over the cover of Crime Suspense Stories number 22, in an exchange that made the front page of the New York Times. The subcommittee eventually decided to not take any legislative action against comic book publishers, but before they released their verdict, those publishers had already reacted to the tense climate of the time and the negative press. They developed the Comics Code, and the Comics Code Authority, or CCA, enforced it. Headed up by an independent New York judge who specialized in juvenile delinquency, the CCA decided which comics would receive the Comics Code Authority seal, based on whether or not their content followed the Comics Code. Print distributors, who were also wary of public opinion, eagerly pledged to abide by the CCA's rules. So either you told your story by the code, or it wouldn't get printed. Here are just a few of the code's most egregious rules. Crimes shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. All characters shall be depicted in dress reasonably acceptable to society. And, in every instance, good shall triumph over evil and the criminal be punished for his misdeeds. But the Comics Code wasn't just a panicked attempt at self-preservation. It was also deliberately designed by the folks involved to push their biggest competitor out of business. And that competitor was William Gaines's EC Comics, a frequent publisher of horror, crime, and satire comics. You might not recognize the name EC Comics today, but you probably recognize Tales from the Crypt, the horror anthology that was once EC's most popular comic. And you should recognize Mad, a comic series that was canceled because it had no hope of ever being published under the Comics Code. To survive, its format was retooled, and it re-emerged as a magazine, Mad Magazine. Under the Comics Code, you explicitly could not write about zombies, vampires, werewolves, sex, drug use, homosexuality, government authorities as villains, or depict basically any morally gray situation. That's why so many comics were so weird in the 50s and 60s. Morally neutral absurdity was literally the only way creators could push the envelope. But the greatest irony of the Comics Code was that when it finally started to fall, it was because of Richard Nixon.
Fuck me.
In 1971, the Nixon administration's Department of Health, Education, and Welfare approached Stan Lee, requesting that Marvel Comics run an explicit anti-drug abuse story in a major book. Lee wrote the 3-issue storyline starting in The Amazing Spider-Man number 96. The CCA refused to approve it on the basis that it depicted the use of narcotics, but Marvel ran the comics anyway because the president literally asked them to do it. The story was well received, the CCA's objections were deemed wrong-headed, and a major blow to the authority's authority had been struck. In response, the CCA drafted a newer, more liberal version of the code, but at the same time the 70s saw the rise of so-called underground comics, a push to make comics for adults that depicted everything the code wouldn't approve of, including the work of R. Crumb and Harvey Pekar. By the end of the decade, only 4 publishers still used the Comics Code seal: Marvel, DC, Archie, and Harvey Comics. Then, major changes in distribution methods during the 1980s significantly weakened the CCA's only power, a print industry dominated by wholesalers who wouldn't print comics without its seal. In 2001, Marvel Comics abandoned the code in favor of its own in-house rating system. And a decade later, DC Comics announced that it would be dropping the seal from its covers. Soon after, the only remaining participating comics publisher, Archie, followed suit. Happy ending, right? It's commonly accepted today that comics are a medium, not a genre, and can be used to tell all kinds of stories for all kinds of ages. Well, sort of. The Comics Code may be gone, but it irrevocably delayed the advancement of comics as a respected art form in America. Before the code, the American comics industry was a thriving market with a wide variety of genres like romance, horror, crime, and classic pulp sci-fi. In fact, the best-selling genre back then wasn't superheroes, it was horror comics. The Comics Code also cemented the idea that comic books are for children into American culture, and that starved the market down to essentially one genre, making comics synonymous with superheroes for half a century.
Precisely, Robin. The only possible meaning.
It's been at least 2 decades since the code had any teeth, and still more than 2/3 of the industry's current market share is dominated by Marvel and DC.
Let's go. But inconspicuously.
All those old bizarre comics covers are fun to look back on now, but they represent a time when the industry was artistically locked in place for years because of a transient period of panic. You can see the fallout in American comics even after the code, as the medium struggled to present itself as relevant to adults. Honestly, it sometimes seems like that pendulum has swung a little too far. The only place that uses the seal of the Comics Code Authority these days is the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, a charitable organization that fights censorship and works to preserve the First Amendment rights of comic book creators in the US. If you look closely, you'll notice I actually wear one of their pins on every episode of Issue at Hand. That's the best use of the seal these days, a reminder of our comic book past and as delicious, delicious irony. Next time on Issue at Hand, join me as I discuss
Star Wars,
evil,
Star Wars,
and
Star Wars.
That's right, I'm finally going to do a whole episode about
Star Wars.
There's a Jimmy Olsen cover where it's like Superman is pulling a bathrobe with the Superman symbol on it out of a box and burning it with his laser vision, and he's like, Jimmy, you got me this for Father's Day and it's a terrible present. And Jimmy's like, but Superman, I mean, Dad, like what's wrong with it?